34 years old, a red beret, a captain who never asked for a throne. In a world where leaders are often made in boardrooms, this story begins in the dust. It begins where the cameras usually stop rolling. They called it a coup. They called it chaos. But look closer at the faces of the people in the streets of Ouagadougou. They did not see a usurper. They saw a breath of air for a suffocating nation. For decades, the narrative has been written for them. Helpless, hungry, dependent. But the script has changed. This is not a story of charity. This is not a plea for aid. This is the violent, beautiful birth of sovereignty. Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a hinge in history. If you refuse to accept the old narrative of a helpless Africa, subscribe and stand with the story to understand the harvest. We must first taste the bitterness of the soil. Before September 2022, Burkina Faso, the land of upright men, was being forced to its knees. The country was not just bleeding, it was being hollowed out. Terrorist insurgencies had swept across the Sahel like a plague of locusts, turning fertile lands into graveyards. By some estimates, 40% of the territory had slipped from the state's control. Schools were closed. Markets were silent. The road, once a lifeline, had become a death trap. But the tragedy was not just the violence. It was the indifference. While soldiers on the front lines were reportedly eating raw leaves to survive, lacking ammunition and air support, the leadership in the capital seemed paralyzed. The then leader, Paul Henry Sandaogo Damiba, had promised security. Instead, the people saw him toasting with the very colonial powers they believed were complicit in their suffering. The disconnect was absolute. The palace was air-conditioned. The barracks were burning. The soil was dry. But it was waiting for a spark. That spark did not come from a politician. It came from the Cobra unit, an elite counter-terrorism detachment, living in the mud and the blood of the conflict. On the 30th of September, 2022, gunshots rang out in the capital. It was not the sound of ambition. It was the sound of desperation. A young officer, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, stepped out of the shadows. He was an anomaly. He did not look like a president. He looked like a soldier who had just walked off the battlefield because he had. His uniform was not ceremonial. It was stained with the reality of war. When he spoke, he did not offer complex diplomatic platitudes. He spoke of necessary recoil. He spoke of the comrades he had buried. "We have decided to take our responsibilities," he said. The words were simple, but the weight was immense. This moment was not just a change of guard. It was a resurrection. For many Burkinabés, seeing Traoré in that red beret was like seeing a ghost return from 1987. The spirit of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary icon assassinated decades prior, seemed to flicker back to life in the eyes of this young captain. The seed that Sankara had planted in the hearts of the people, the idea that a black nation could stand tall without a master, had been buried under 30 years of dust. But as the proverb goes, they tried to bury us. They didn't know we were seeds. Traoré's rise was the rain that the seed had been waiting for. But let us be clear. This was not a fairy tale. It was a fracture. The taking of power is the easy part. Holding it against the weight of history is the burden. Traoré inherited a nation on the brink of collapse. The treasury was strained. The army was fractured, and the enemies were not just the terrorists hiding in the bush. They were the established orders, the old contracts, and the invisible hands that have steered African politics for 60 years. He stood on the balcony, the youngest leader in the world, looking out at a sea of cheering youth. They saw a hero. He likely saw the magnitude of the task. He knew that the cheers of the crowd are ephemeral. Today they clap. Tomorrow, they demand bread. and he had no bread to give, only a vision of dignity. "We are not here to last," he told them. "We are here for a mission." The mission was not just to fight terrorists. It was to reclaim the soul of the nation. But to do that, he would have to make enemies, powerful enemies. He would have to look at the partners who had been in the country for decades. Foreign armies, ambassadors, and mining corporations, and ask the dangerous question: if you have been here to help us for so long, why are we still dying? The answer to that question would set Burkina Faso on a collision course with the West. The young captain had taken the wheel, but he was driving directly into a storm. The sun had risen over Ouagadougou, but the shadows were lengthening. The real war, the war for the mind and the war for the gold, was about to begin. To build a house, you must sometimes tear down the walls that restrict your view. For Burkina Faso, those walls had stood for over 60 years. They were invisible walls, built of debt, dependence, and a colonial pact that never truly ended. For decades, the presence of foreign troops, specifically the French Special Forces under Operation Sabre, was sold to the public as a shield. They were there to protect. They were there to assist. But as the years turned into decades and the body count rose, the people began to ask a terrifying question. If the firefighter is living in your house, why is the fire still burning? Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not just ask the question. He acted upon the answer. In January 2023, just months after taking power, the announcement came. It was not a negotiation. It was not a polite diplomatic request buried in a communiqué. It was a notification to the French government. Pack your bags. The demand for the departure of French troops was a geopolitical earthquake. To the West, it was framed as ingratitude, a pivot towards chaos. To the youth of the Sahel, it was the sound of a chain snapping. "This is not against the French people," the sentiment on the streets echoed. "This is against a system that keeps us on our knees." For the first time in generations, the skies of Burkina Faso were to be patrolled solely by Burkinabés. The base at Combouenzine, once a symbol of foreign power projection, was reclaimed. It was a risk of immense proportions. The French withdrew, taking their surveillance drones, their intelligence, and their funding. They predicted collapse. They waited for the inevitable failure. But sovereignty is not safe. Sovereignty is the right to make your own mistakes and the duty to find your own solutions. Then came the moment the world could not ignore. July 2023. St. Petersburg, the Russia-Africa Summit. The hall was filled with heads of statesmen in expensive suits, seasoned politicians who had played the diplomatic game for decades. And there, amongst them, sat the youngest leader in the room, wearing his combat fatigues and a red beret. He did not look like he belonged in a palace. He looked like he was ready to storm one. When Ibrahim Traoré took the microphone, he did not read a prepared speech about mutual cooperation or sustainable development goals. He delivered a manifesto. His voice was calm, but his words were blades. He looked at the other African leaders, some of whom had been in power longer than he had been alive, and he challenged their silence. He spoke of the paradox of a continent that sleeps on gold, yet goes hungry. He spoke of the hypocrisy of a world that lectures Africa on democracy while ignoring its plight. And then he delivered the line that would resonate from Dakar to Johannesburg. "A slave who does not rebel does not deserve pity." The African Union must stop condemning Africans who decide to fight against their own puppet regimes of the West. It was a slap in the face of the established order. It was a rejection of the pity that the West had offered for centuries. Pity is easy. Partnership is hard. Pity builds refugee camps. Partnership builds factories. Pity sends bags of rice. Partnership shares the technology to grow it. Traoré was declaring the end of the era of the good student. Burkina Faso would no longer be the obedient pupil of the IMF or the quiet recipient of conditional aid. We have forgotten that we are the source. he seemed to say. The gold in their vaults, the uranium in their reactors, the cocoa in their chocolate. It comes from our soil. Why then do we beg for the crumbs of our own feast? This was the pivotal shift, from aid to trade, from charity to dignity. Critics called him naive. They called him a populist, playing to the gallery. They warned that turning away from traditional partners like France and the United States would isolate the country. And indeed, the isolation began. Aid was cut. Military cooperation was suspended. The World Bank paused disbursements. The international community, that nebulous club of wealthy nations, turned its back. But in the dust of Ouagadougou, the mood was not fear. It was defiance. They called it risk. We call it dignity. The chain was broken. The foreign soldiers were gone. The ambassadors were being summoned. The young captain had cleared the board. But a cleared board is not a victory. It is merely an empty space. And in geopolitics, empty spaces are dangerous. When the lion leaves, the hyenas do not simply disappear. They circle closer. The French had left, but the terrorists remained. And now, a new, silent war was beginning. A war of economics, of sabotage, and of survival. The captain had won the argument, but could he win the war for bread and peace? The euphoria of the summit was fading. The reality of the trenches was waiting. The loudest battles are fought with guns, but the most important wars are fought with grain. For generations, the script was simple. You export your gold, and you import your bread. You sell your raw cotton for pennies, and you buy back the shirts for pounds. It was a cycle of poverty disguised as trade. It was a system designed to keep the stomach empty, so the hand remains outstretched. Captain Ibrahim Traoré understood a fundamental truth that his predecessor, Thomas Sankara, had preached 40 years ago. He who feeds you controls you. If you cannot feed your own soldiers, you cannot win a war. If you cannot feed your own children, you are not a free nation. And so, the offensive Agropastorale began. It was not just a policy. It was a mobilization. The tractor became as important as the tank. The dusty soils of Burkina Faso are now the front line of an agricultural revolution. In the Agropastorale region and across the arid zones, the government did not wait for World Bank consultants to write a feasibility study. They simply started digging. They deployed the army not to shoot, but to farm. Soldiers worked alongside civilians to clear thousands of hectares for wheat, rice, and maize. The skeptics laughed. They said wheat could not grow in the Sahel heat. They said the soil was too poor. But when the first harvest came golden and defiant against the dry wind, the laughter stopped. This is not just food, the message rang out. This is freedom. Traoré launched the Actionnariat Populaire, popular shareholding, a radical economic experiment. Instead of begging for loans from the IMF with crippling interest rates, he asked his own people to invest. Build your own factory, he urged. Process your own tomatoes. Refine your own gold. And the people responded. They queued in the streets, not to protest, but to buy shares in their own future. A tomato processing factory in Bobo Dioulasso, funded by the citizens, became a symbol of this new pride. For decades, Burkinabés saw their tomatoes rot in the fields while they bought tinned paste from Europe. No more. They called it protectionism. We call it survival. But the greatest theft was not the food. It was the ground beneath their feet. Gold. For years, multinational corporations have extracted ton after ton of gold from the Burkina earth, flying it out to be refined in Switzerland or Dubai, leaving behind only holes and cyanide. The wealth of the land was building skyscrapers in foreign cities, while the villages next to the mines had no electricity. Traore's government made a move that sent shockwaves through the mining boardrooms of the world: the construction of a national gold refinery. It seems like a small technical detail, but it is a revolutionary act. By refining gold at home, the value stays at home. By reviewing mining codes, the state demands its fair share. The gold of Burkina Faso must shine. For Burkinabés, first is the unwritten law of this new era. This is the transition from a rentier state living off the scraps thrown by foreign companies to a producer state. It is the difference between a servant and a master. However, let us not paint a false paradise. This road is paved with glass. The economic war is silent, and it is brutal. When you kick out the masters, they do not just leave. They turn off the lights. Prices fluctuate. Sabotage of infrastructure is a constant threat. The cost of living rises, testing the patience of the very people Traoré swore to protect. The international community watches with folded arms, perhaps waiting for the hunger to bite, waiting for the people to tire of dignity, and ask for the easy aid to return. Is it better to eat well in chains, or to eat bread you baked yourself in freedom? This is the question every Burkinabé must answer every day. The government is betting everything on the resilience of its people. They are betting that pride is a stronger nutrient than pity. But while the farmers are planting seeds of hope, the enemies in the bush are planting IEDs. The tractor can fight hunger, but it cannot fight a phantom. The terrorists, emboldened by the departure of foreign troops and funded by shadowy networks, are regrouping. They know that if this experiment in sovereignty succeeds, it will be a contagion. If Burkina Faso stands, who is next? The stakes have never been higher. The grain is in the silo. The gold is in the vault. But the sound of motorcycles is approaching from the horizon. When the world closes its doors, you do not knock harder. You build a new house. The West thought that by cutting aid and imposing sanctions, they would isolate Burkina Faso. They thought the pressure would crack the resolve of the young captain. They were wrong. Isolation did not break them. It forged them. In the heat of the Sahel, a new geopolitical reality was born: the Alliance of Sahel States, AS. On September 16, 2023, the leaders of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso signed the Liptako-Gourma Charter. It was a historic moment that shredded the colonial maps drawn in Berlin over a century ago. These three nations, all led by military officers who had rejected the old order, declared a simple, ironclad truth: an attack on one is an attack on all. This was not just a mutual defense pact. It was a declaration of independence from ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States. For decades, ECOWAS had been seen by many in the region not as a protector, but as a policeman for Western interests quick to sanction coups that threatened the status quo, but slow to condemn constitutional coups that kept puppets in power. Traoré and his counterparts saw through the veil. They realized that fighting terrorism alone was suicide. The borders in the Sahel are porous lines in the sand. The terrorists do not respect them. So why should the armies? By uniting, they created a single theater of operations. No longer could a terrorist strike in Burkina and flee to safety in Niger. The walls were closing in. But a soldier needs more than brotherhood. He needs bullets. With the French out, a vacuum appeared. And in geopolitics, vacuums are filled instantly. Critics scream that Burkina Faso has simply traded one master for another, swapping the French tricolor for the Russian flag. But look closer at the strategy. This is not submission. It is diversification. In this high-stakes game of survival, Ibrahim Traoré is not playing by the old rules of exclusive loyalty. He is shopping for security. When he needs drones to watch the vast, ungoverned spaces, he looks to Turkey and their Bayraktars. When he needs heavy weaponry and counter-terrorism instructors to train the Cobras, he looks to Russia. It is a transactional relationship, stripped of the moral lectures and conditionalities that came with Western aid. We do not want masters, the philosophy goes. We want partners who sell us the gun, not the hand that holds it. The message to Washington and Brussels is clear. The monopoly is over. The era of the single partner is dead. Yet, this pivot comes with immense risk. By inviting Russian influence, the Sahel has become a new front line in a global proxy war. The West watches with growing alarm as its foothold in Africa crumbles. They fear the domino effect. If the EES succeeds, if they can secure their lands and feed their people without Western oversight, what does that say to the rest of the continent? The example is dangerous, and dangerous examples are often extinguished. The alliance is strong on paper. The drones are patrolling the skies. The three captains stand shoulder to shoulder. But the ink on the charter is barely dry, and the whispers of counter-coups are getting louder in the corridors of power. The enemy knows that you cannot defeat an idea with a bullet, but you can assassinate the man who holds the idea. The applause of the summit fades. The rhetoric of the speeches cools. And now, Burkina Faso faces the cold, hard morning after the revolution. The road ahead is not a paved highway. It is a dirt track through a minefield. We must not be naive. The risks are existential. The terrorists, the hydra-headed monster in the bush, have not vanished. They are adapting. Pushed back from the cities, they retreat into the shadows, planting IEDs on the roads that carry the nation's food. Every truck destroyed is a victory for fear. Every village that falls silent is a blow to the promise of security. Economically, the siege is real. The international community plays a waiting game. They hold the purse strings, hoping that inflation will do what sanctions could not: break the spirit of the people. They count on the fatigue of the mother who cannot buy medicine, on the frustration of the youth who cannot find a job. The question hangs heavy in the air: can a nation eat dignity? History is littered with revolutionaries who started as heroes and ended as tyrants or martyrs. The danger for the young captain is not just the assassin's bullet. It is the isolation of power. When you are surrounded by enemies, paranoia can become your only advisor. The temptation to tighten the grip, to silence the critics who ask difficult questions about the timeline of elections, is a poison that has killed many African dreams before. But there is another scenario. A scenario that keeps the lights on in Washington and Paris late at night. What if he succeeds? What if the offensive Agropastorale actually feeds the nation? What if the gold refinery actually funds the schools? What if the alliance of Sahel states becomes a fortress of stability, proving that Africans can secure Africa without a foreign chaperone? If Burkina Faso succeeds, it destroys the narrative of dependency forever. It proves that the resource curse is not a law of nature, but a design of empire. It would be a signal fire on a dark continent, visible from Congo to Sudan. This is why the pressure is so immense. They are not just trying to crush a government. They are trying to crush an example. The people know this. Walk through the markets of Ouagadougou, and you will see it in their eyes. They are tired, yes. They are hungry, perhaps. But they are not broken. They have tasted the intoxicating air of sovereignty, and they are unwilling to go back to the suffocating comfort of the cage. We prefer freedom in poverty to slavery in opulence, Sekou Touré once said. Today, that is not a slogan. It is a daily choice. The captain has pointed to the horizon, but he cannot walk the road for them. He is the spark, but the people are the fuel. The revolution is not the man in the palace. It is the farmer planting wheat in the desert. It is the mechanic repairing the tank. It is the teacher explaining to a child why their flag matters. The storm is still raging. The night is still dark, but for the first time in decades, the compass is in their own hands. The map is being redrawn, not with ink, but with sweat and blood, and the world is holding its breath. The dust has not settled. The storm has not passed, but something fundamental has changed in the air. For too long, the story of this continent has been written with the ink of pity. We have been told that we are too poor to choose, too weak to stand, and too divided to lead. We have been told that sovereignty is a luxury we cannot afford. But look at the red earth of Burkina Faso. It is telling a different story. It is whispering that a nation does not need permission to be free. It does not need a savior from across the ocean. It needs the courage to look in the mirror. Captain Ibrahim Traoré may be the face of this moment, but he is not the revolution. The revolution is the grandmother in the village who refuses to flee. It is the student in Ouagadougou who demands that his textbooks tell his own history. It is the realization that the gold in the ground is worth nothing if the soul of the nation is sold. This path is dangerous. The shadows of the past are long, and the empires that are losing their grip will not let go without a fight. The sanctions will bite. The nights will be cold. But ask yourself, what is the price of a soul? If Burkina Faso can stand surrounded, sanctioned, and besieged and still proclaim that it owns its future, then what excuse is left for the rest of us? This is not just a story about borders or geopolitics. It is a story about the human capacity to say no. No to the chains of debt. No to the charity that humiliates. No to the silence of the slave. The seed has been planted in the fire. Whether it grows into a mighty baobab or is scorched by the heat depends on the will of the people. But one thing is certain. The sleep is over. The giant is awake. The map of the world is changing. And for the first time in centuries, the pen is in African hands. Do not look away. What comes next may change how we read history forever. If you believe that dignity is worth the struggle, subscribe and walk this road with us.